The morning sun had barely crested the ridge when Marshal Amos Malone planted himself in the center of Caldwell Street, both boots square on the packed red earth, and refused to move. Mae Whitaker stood 20 yards away, her leather traveling bag clutched in both hands, her jaw set like iron, her dark eyes burning with something that looked very much like fury but felt, in the deepest chambers of her chest, like the most desperate kind of grief. The whistle of the westbound train screamed through the valley below the town of Red Rock, Texas, in the year 1882, and the sound of it cut through me like a serrated blade. "You need to step aside, Marshal," she said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced steady for 3 years. Amos did not move. He stood 6 feet and 2 inches of broad-shouldered, sun-weathered stubbornness with a silver star pinned to his chest and a look on his face that Mae had never seen on any man before. It was not anger. It was not authority. It was something terrifyingly close to desperation. "She is not getting on that train today," he said, and he said it loudly enough that the half-dozen souls gathered on the boardwalk of the Red Rock General Store heard every syllable. Old Harriet Bowman, who swept her porch every morning whether it needed it or not, went very still with her broom. Young Tommy Greer, who delivered mail on Tuesdays, forgot he was holding 3 envelopes. Mae took 1 step forward, then another. "You have no legal authority to stop me from boarding that train, Amos Malone. None, and you know it." "I know a lot of things," he said, and something flickered behind his gray eyes, something dark and layered and achingly private. "I know that the man waiting for you in El Paso is not what you think he is." The words hit her like a fist. Not because she hadn't considered it, not because she was naive, but because hearing it from Amos, hearing it from this particular man on this particular morning, unraveled something inside her that she had been stitching together for months. She stopped 3 feet from him, close enough to see the muscle working in his jaw, close enough to smell the cedar soap he used every morning before he made his rounds through town, a detail she hated that she knew. "What did you say?" she whispered. "You heard me, Mae." The train whistle screamed again, longer this time, insistent. "You have exactly 1 minute to move out of my way or explain yourself," she said. "And if you choose to explain yourself, it had better be the most honest thing you have ever said to another human being." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved through the single oak tree at the end of Caldwell Street, scattering dry leaves across the road between them. In all the years Mae Whitaker had lived in Red Rock, in all the complicated, thorny, electric history between herself and this man, she had never seen him look quite this undone. "Then let me explain," he said quietly. "But not here, not like this. Give me 1 hour, Mae, 1 hour. If after that you still want to get on the next train, I will carry your bag to the platform myself." She should have said no. Every rational fiber she possessed told her to walk around him, to keep walking, to climb onto that train and leave Red Rock and Amos Malone and all of it behind. She should have said no. She said, 1 hour. And that was how it began. Or rather, that was how it almost ended. To understand it properly, to understand how a strong-willed schoolteacher and a stubborn marshal had arrived at this cracked and trembling precipice, you had to go back. Back to the autumn of 1880, back to the day Mae Whitaker first set foot in Red Rock, Texas, with a carpetbag, a teaching certificate, and a heart that was learning, very slowly and very painfully, how to trust the world again. She had come from San Antonio, where she had spent 4 years teaching the children of wealthy merchant families, and 2 years trying to recover from a secret so heavy it had changed the shape of her spine. Her former fiancé, a man named Gerald Fitch, had been a banker's son with a smile that could sell water in a flood. He had promised her everything and delivered nothing except a broken engagement, a reputation she'd had to claw back piece by piece, and a profound distrust of men who said things they couldn't prove. She never talked about Gerald Fitch. She never talked about those 2 years of recovery. When she arrived in Red Rock in September of 1880, the only thing the town saw was a composed, capable, beautiful woman of 26 who carried herself like she'd made peace with every hard thing life had thrown at her. Redrock was a cattle town at its core, with a raw main street, a church that doubled as a courthouse on Tuesdays, a school that desperately needed a real teacher, and a population of approximately 300 souls divided fairly evenly between the permanently settled and the perpetually passing through. It sat in the rolling red dirt country of West Texas, where the sky was so enormous it made a person feel simultaneously liberated and terrified, and where the nearest city of consequence was a day's hard ride in any direction. The marshal's office was the third building from the north end of Caldwell Street. Mae noticed it on her first walk through town because of the man sitting in the chair outside it, boots crossed on the railing, hat tipped forward, apparently asleep. Apparently. She had taken 3 steps past when his voice reached her without him moving an inch. "You're the new school teacher," he said. She stopped, turned. He still hadn't moved the hat. "I am," she said. "Mae Whitaker," he said. "From San Antonio. The school board's been talking about you for a month." He tipped the hat back then, and she got her first clear look at Amos Malone. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 29 or 30, with gray eyes the color of winter sky, and a face that was all angles and weathered planes, the kind of face that would never be pretty but would always be worth looking at. The silver star on his shirt caught the afternoon sun. "Do you make a habit of listening to gossip, Marshal?" she asked. "I make a habit of knowing what's happening in my town," he said, without a hint of apology. Different thing. She had not been charmed by him. She had been, in her private heart, absolutely charmed by him, and that had made her proceed with extreme caution for the next several weeks. She settled into the small house the school board provided, 2 rooms behind the schoolhouse, and threw herself into the work of educating Redrock's children with a ferocity that surprised even herself. There were 14 students ranging in age from 6 to 15, and they arrived each morning in various states of preparation. From Tommy Greer's younger sister Clara, who always had her lessons memorized, to the Ray's twins who had to be dragged in by their ears and yet, once sitting, proved to be the sharpest minds in the room. She loved the work. She had always loved the work. Teaching was the one place in her life where the hidden motives and dark past complications that seemed to characterize her experience of the adult world fell away entirely, and what remained was simply the extraordinary business of watching a mind open. Amos came to her schoolhouse for the first time in October, 6 weeks after her arrival, not for any romantic reason, but for a practical one. There had been trouble at the far edge of town, a dispute between a local rancher named Caldwell and a group of trail hands who'd lingered too long after a cattle drive, and one of the trail hands had made a comment about the new schoolteacher that Amos had apparently found unacceptable. He came to tell her, he said, not to alarm her, but because she had a right to know there had been a confrontation, and that the man in question had been strongly encouraged to leave Redrock immediately. "I can handle myself," she told him. "I know you can," he said, and he said it in a way that made it clear he genuinely believed it, not in the dismissive way she'd been told similar things before, where handling herself was another way of saying she'd better not cause problems. She studied him for a moment. "How do you know that? You've barely spoken 10 words to me." "I've watched you work," he said. "You've got 14 kids who were basically feral when you arrived, and you've had them reading aloud in front of each other for 3 weeks. That takes somebody who knows how to hold ground." She did not know what to do with that, so she thanked him politely and went back to grading papers, and he left, and she sat for a full 15 minutes afterward thinking about the way he had said it, like she was a fact he'd observed and filed away, like he respected facts. The friendship built slowly, in the way that genuine things do. It was not linear. It moved forward and doubled back and got tangled in misunderstandings and cleared itself and moved forward again. Redrock was a small town and they were both public figures in it, so avoidance was impossible and small talk was unavoidable. And somewhere between the small talk and the unavoidable proximity, something real began to grow. He started checking on the schoolhouse in the evenings, not every evening, but often enough that she began to expect it. She told herself it was routine patrol. He told himself the same thing. Neither of them examined the explanation too closely. In November, she made the mistake of telling him about Gerald Fitch. It was not a planned confession. It came out the way true things sometimes do, sideways, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely. They were on her small porch after dark, and she had made coffee on the stove and brought out 2 cups, and they were talking about trust, abstractly, philosophically, in the way that 2 careful people discuss something they are actually discussing quite specifically without admitting it. "I had a reason to stop trusting people's stated intentions," she said. "A particular reason. 3 years ago." He waited. He was very good at waiting. It was one of the things about him that was simultaneously reassuring and unsettling. She told him the essential facts: Gerald Fitch, the engagement. The discovered truth that Gerald had pursued her specifically because her late father had left her a modest inheritance that Gerald had known about, and she had not. The humiliation of understanding that what she had taken for love was a transaction she hadn't been informed of. The longer humiliation of having her reputation questioned afterward, because it was somehow her fault for being deceived, because she was a woman and women were expected to know better, and if you didn't know better then clearly there was something wrong with you. When she finished, Amos said nothing for so long that she began to regret saying any of it. Then he said, "Gerald Fitch sounds like a coward." "Yes," she said, "he was. People who use other people's trust as a weapon are cowards," he said. "It doesn't reflect on you." "I know that," she said. "I know it here." She touched her temple. "It takes longer to know it everywhere else." He nodded slowly. "That's honest." "I try to be honest," she said. "I know," he said. And then, after a pause, "So do I." She looked at him in the thin lamplight from the doorway, at this quietly complicated man who had somehow ended up knowing things about her she'd told almost no one, and she felt the dangerous, intoxicating sensation of her careful defenses shifting under his feet. She didn't do anything about it. She filed it away. She kept her distance, which in a town of 300 people meant she kept an emotional distance, a careful professional warmth that she maintained with steady discipline. December brought cold and the smell of mesquite smoke from every chimney in Red Rock, and a traveling preacher who stirred up the congregation at Christmas with a sermon about the dangers of solitude, and a letter from Me's cousin Alina in Houston recommending a man named Harlan Cross. Alina's letter was enthusiastic in the way that Alina's letters always were, full of exclamation points and sweeping characterizations. Harlan Cross was a businessman, the letter said, recently relocated from Kansas City to El Paso, involved in land investment and railroad contracts, recently widowed and therefore serious in his search for a wife, respectable, established, well-liked. Alina had met him through her husband's business circles. She thought he would be perfect for me, and she had already, she confessed in the second-to-last paragraph, taken the liberty of writing to him about me and sending a photograph. Me set the letter down and stared at the wall of her little schoolhouse. She was 26 years old. She was a schoolteacher in a West Texas cattle town. She had a dark past and a guarded heart and a specific and complicated awareness of a marshal who had gray eyes and a habit of sitting in chairs outside his office like he was solving a puzzle in his head. She was also a practical woman who understood that practical women had to think practically about their futures. She wrote back to Harlan Cross. His response arrived in late January and was everything Alina had promised. He was articulate. He was thoughtful. He was careful with his words in a way that me, given her history, appreciated as an indicator of character. They began a correspondence that was measured at first and grew warmer through the spring. She didn't tell Amos. She told herself this was because it was a private matter and none of his business. She told herself this successfully for several months. Amos noticed that something had changed. He was a perceptive man by profession and by nature, and the slight new guardedness in Me's manner registered with him the way a change in wind direction registered with a man who'd spent years reading the sky. He didn't push it. He had his own complications. In April of 1881, a man named Dred Calloway rode into Red Rock. He was not the kind of man you missed. He was broad and dark-browed with a scar that pulled the left corner of his mouth into a permanent sneer, and he had 3 other men with him, and they had the look of people who had ridden hard and left trouble behind them. Calloway asked around about a land parcel east of town that had recently changed ownership, and the questions he was asking made the new owner, a farmer named Samuel Keach, deeply nervous. Amos had history with Dred Calloway. Not recent history, but the kind that sits in a man's bones. They had grown up in the same part of central Texas, 20 miles apart. Calloway had been 12 years older, which when Amos was a boy had made him seem like a force of nature, impressive and terrifying in the way that powerful things are before you understand what makes them dangerous. Later, Amos had understood what made Dred Calloway dangerous. It was the total absence of obligation to anyone except himself. The situation with Calloway was Amos's first real crisis as the Marshal of Red Rock, and it consumed him for 6 weeks, through a period of low-grade menace and escalating tension that put the whole town on edge. Calloway claimed he had legal rights to Keach's land through a prior sale, and the paperwork he produced was troublingly convincing, and the circuit judge wasn't due for 2 months. It was me who found the flaw in Calloway's documents. She found it by accident, or something that looked like accident. She had spent a Saturday afternoon in the marshal's office, helping Amos organize the territorial records he'd inherited from his predecessor, a man of limited organizational impulse, and she'd come across an earlier land survey that contradicted a key date on Calloway's deed. She'd brought it to Amos with a calm matter-of-factness that made him stare at her for a moment before he read it. "How did you even know to look for this?" he asked. "I didn't," she said. "I was just alphabetizing." But her eyes were bright with the satisfaction of it, and he laughed, which was something he didn't do easily or often, and the sound of it in the small room was like sunlight coming through a door that had been shut for a long time. The survey invalidated Calloway's claim. Calloway argued loudly and then departed with his men, and a promise to return that Amos took seriously and filed under problems not yet finished. He wrote a report to the territorial office in Austin and set up a regular patrol of the Keach property boundary, and then he put Dred Calloway at the back of his mind and turned his attention back to the ordinary business of keeping Red Rock safe. But he didn't forget what Mae had done. He didn't forget the way she'd walked into his office with that document like it was nothing, like helping was just what people did. He didn't forget the bright look in her eyes. Summer settled over Red Rock in a long, slow burn. The cottonwood trees along the creek bed lost their spring green and turned the dry silver gold of drought. Mae taught summer sessions for the students who were behind. She corresponded with Harlan Cross. She and Amos fell into a rhythm that she could only describe, in her private journal, as something she was afraid to name. They ate dinner together on Friday evenings. This had evolved without either of them formally proposing it. It had started in May when they'd both ended up at the hotel dining room on the same evening and been seated together for the sake of efficiency, and it had continued by mutual, unspoken agreement every Friday since. They talked about everything, about the students she was trying to reach, about the political complications of territorial law that frustrated him, about books, which was the subject on which they were most freely themselves, because books were a safe territory, neutral ground where she could disagree with him passionately, and he could push back with equal passion, and neither of them was risking anything except the argument, which they both secretly loved. "You can't honestly defend that ending," she said in June, about a novel she'd lent him. "The ending is the only honest part of the whole book," he said. "The rest of it is the author convincing you that good intentions protect people from consequences. The ending is where he finally tells the truth." "It's nihilistic," she said. "It's realistic," he said. "There is room in realism for hope," she said. He looked at her across the table, at the way her dark eyes went sharp when she argued something she cared about, at the way she leaned forward slightly as if getting closer to the truth by physical proximity. "Yes," he said, "there is." There was a moment of silence after he said it that had a weight to it, that pressed on the air between them with the weight of something neither of them had yet said aloud. Then Mae picked up her fork and changed the subject, and they went on with dinner, and nothing was acknowledged, and both of them went home separately to their separate lives, and Mae sat at her small desk and wrote 3 pages in her journal about a man she had no business feeling the way she felt about him. In July she told him about Harlan Cross. She did it deliberately, methodically, on a Tuesday afternoon when she came by the marshal's office to drop off a territorial education report that needed forwarding. She mentioned it in a tone she had rehearsed. "My cousin introduced me to someone last December," she said. "By letter. I've been corresponding with him since January. He's proposed a meeting." She watched Amos's face for the thing she was afraid of seeing. She couldn't have said exactly what she was afraid of seeing. Something that would tell her what he felt. Something that would make everything more complicated than she could manage. His face did not change in any obvious way. He nodded slowly. "What do you know about him?" "His name is Harlan Cross. He's a businessman in El Paso. Land investment and railroad contracts. Widower. Well regarded from what my cousin tells me." "Have you looked into him yourself?" he asked. This was such an entirely Amos Malone response, so thoroughly him, so immediate in its protective instinct that she almost smiled. "Not formally," she said. "A leaner is not the most objective source." "I could look into him," he said, "through the marshal's network." "That seems excessive for a correspondence," she said. "It seems reasonable for someone you might be planning to meet," he said, and then after a careful pause, "or more than meet." She held his gaze for a moment. "I haven't decided anything yet." "All right," he said. She left. She walked back to the schoolhouse in the July heat and stood in the empty classroom and pressed her hands against a desk until her knuckles went white. And she thought about the flat, careful neutrality in his voice when she'd told him. And she thought about what she needed him to have said instead. And she thought about how fundamentally unfair it was to need something from a person you'd never given permission to know you needed it. She told herself this was exactly why you didn't fall in love with people in small towns, because you couldn't get away from them. Then she went home and wrote another letter to Harlan Cross agreeing to a meeting in early November, after she'd arranged for a substitute teacher for a week. Amos did look into Harlan Cross. He did it quietly, through the territorial marshals network that connected lawmen across Texas and into New Mexico, because he told himself it was his job to know about new people coming into his town's orbit, and Mae's El Paso correspondent was new to his orbit, and therefore his professional business. What the network returned was largely consistent with what a leaner had told me. Harlan Cross, age 42, widower, business interests in land and railroad contracts, established in El Paso since 1879. A minor note from a Kansas City contact about some complicated business dealings that had been resolved without any formal charges. Nothing that rose to the level of alarm. Nothing that gave Amos a legitimate reason to say anything. He said nothing. He did, however, find himself thinking about Gerald Fitch. About what Mae had told him in November about the way a man's hidden motives could operate behind a convincing surface for months or years before the surface cracked. About what she'd said about knowing it in one place and taking longer to know it everywhere else. He told himself he was projecting. He told himself the minor note from Kansas City was nothing. He told himself Mae Whitaker was an intelligent, capable, perceptive woman who had every reason to be careful and every ability to take care of herself. He told himself all of this and went back to work, and August became September, and September slid toward October, and Mae's November meeting in El Paso got closer with every page of the calendar, and Amos found himself paying very specific attention to every Friday dinner they had, as if he was memorizing something he was about to lose. In October, Dred Calloway came back. He didn't come back to Rock. He sent a man, a quiet, dry-looking individual named Danslow, who started asking questions about the Territorial Records Office in Austin and about the land dispute from Spring. Amos heard about it from Samuel Keach, who'd seen Danslow in the county seat and recognized the horse. He didn't like it. He wrote again to Austin, requesting a copy of any land record inquiries related to the Keach parcel. He started watching more carefully. Mae noticed the change in him. She had developed, over the past year, a fairly precise internal instrument for reading Amos Malone's moods, which she considered highly inconvenient and refused to examine too closely. She noticed the way he was more alert on his evening rounds, the way his eyes moved along the street with a different quality of attention, the slight tension he carried in the set of his shoulders. "Is something wrong?" she asked on a Friday evening in mid-October. "Nothing confirmed," he said, "but something potential." "Potentially," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Tell me." He told her about Danslow and about Calloway's likely involvement. He told her more than he intended to, because once he started talking to me, the appropriate stopping point was hard to identify. She asked precise, intelligent questions. She made connections he hadn't made yet. "He's building a case," she said. "Not to challenge the land claim again, because that survey you found would defeat him again. He's looking for a procedural error, something in the original filing that he could challenge." Amos looked at her. "How do you know so much about land filing procedure?" "My father was a surveyor," she said. "I spent 3 summers as a girl following him around with a notebook, writing down measurements. I know what the records should look like." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mae, would you be willing to go over those records with me? The full set, not just the survey we found. If there's a procedural error, I'd rather find it before Calloway does." "Of course," she said. They spent 3 evenings in the marshal's office going through papers. It was not romantic in any conventional sense. There was lamplight and coffee, and the sound of the wind against the office window, and there were 2 people sitting across a desk from each other, deeply absorbed in the same problem. But there was also, underneath all of that, the specific quiet intimacy of working closely with someone you trust entirely, and it had a warmth to it that was as real as anything Mae had felt in years. They found the procedural gap Calloway was likely looking for, a missing notary seal on a secondary attachment to the original deed, and they filed a corrective document with Austin before the week was out. Amos sent a firm letter to the Territorial Marshal's office asking that any inquiries related to the Keach parcel be flagged and reported. "I think that solves it," Mae said on the 3rd evening. "For now," he said. She started gathering her papers. He watched her hands sort the documents with efficient grace, and he thought about how much he did not want her to leave next month. Not for El Paso, not for Harlan Cross, not for any reason. "Mae," he said. She looked up. He had things he could have said. He had things that had been building for a year that were trying very hard to find their way out of him. But what he saw in her face was not the look of a woman waiting to be told something she wanted to hear. What he saw was someone who had built her defenses precisely and maintained them carefully, and had every rational reason to do exactly what she was planning to do, which was to go to El Paso and meet a man who had written her careful, thoughtful letters for 10 months and seemed to be offering her a future. "Be careful in El Paso," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and something moved through her expression that he couldn't quite read. "I'm always careful," she said. She left. He sat in his office in the lamplight and felt the full weight of everything he hadn't said. Mae left for El Paso in the first week of November, on the morning train, in a dark green traveling dress that she'd had Mrs. Patterson at the dressmaker's altar to fit properly, with her hair up and her face composed, and her heart doing something that she absolutely refused to acknowledge. She had not told Amos what time her train was leaving. He had found out anyway because Rock was Rock, and he had been at the station when she left, standing on the platform with his hat in his hand like a man who'd come to say something and then decided at the last moment not to say it. He'd helped her with her bag. He'd said, "Safe journey." She'd said, "Thank you." And then she'd gotten on the train and found her seat and looked out the window, and he was still standing on the platform watching the train leave. And the sight of it did something to her throat that she spent the first hour of the journey trying not to think about. Harlan Cross was, in person, almost exactly as his letters had suggested. He was 52, not 42 as Alina had believed, and he was polished in the way of men who have spent decades managing other people's impressions of them. He was attentive and gracious, and said all the right things. He took her to dinner at the best restaurant in El Paso. He showed her the house he was proposing they would share, a handsome place near the center of town. He described a life that was comfortable and settled and safe. Mae sat across from him at dinner and listened and watched, and she used every instrument she had developed over 27 years of paying close attention to people. She looked for the hidden motive behind the polished surface. She looked for the gap between what was said and what was meant. She looked for the particular quality of regard that told you whether someone was seeing you or seeing what they wanted from you. She wasn't sure. That was the honest answer. She wasn't sure about Harlan Cross. She came back to Redrock on a Sunday and was at her desk by Monday morning, and she sat with the not sure feeling for a week, turning it over in her mind like a stone she was trying to find the underside of. On the following Friday, she and Amos had dinner. She told him Harlan Cross was impressive. She told him the proposal was real and the house was substantial, and the life being offered was materially secure. She told him all of it in the measured tone she used when she was trying to report facts without injecting too much feeling. He listened without interrupting. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment. But he said, she looked at him. "What? You told me everything positive about him and none of it had any warmth in it," he said. "There's a but somewhere." This was the specific, maddening, deeply inconvenient quality of Amos Malone. He heard the things you didn't say. "I'm not sure I know him well enough," she said carefully. "I'm not sure a letter correspondence is enough to be sure about a person." He nodded slowly. "That seems right." "I told him I needed more time," she said. He agreed. "We're corresponding still." "Good," Amos said. And then he picked up his coffee cup and changed the subject, and they talked about the students and the cold snap that had come through and the new family that had arrived in Redrock from Kansas, and everything went on as it had been going on. Except that the winter deepened and Mae found that the letters from Harlan Cross were beginning to feel pressured in a way she hadn't noticed at first. He was not aggressive. He was not demanding. But there was a quality that had crept into his writing, a kind of gentle insistence that the decision should be made, that a woman of Mae's obvious intelligence and quality shouldn't need too much time to recognize a good thing. She noticed it. She filed it under things to watch. In December, a marshal from the El Paso district, a man named Fowler who was passing through Redrock en route to Austin, stopped at the marshal's office. He and Amos talked for an hour. After he left, Amos sat at his desk for a long time. Fowler had known the name Harlan Cross. He'd known it because there had been a complaint in El Paso, 2 years prior, from a woman named Dorothea Sims, who had entered into an engagement with Harlan Cross on the basis of a supposed inheritance she'd been due from an estate that was still in legal dispute. The engagement had been broken by Cross when the inheritance didn't materialize on the expected timeline. The woman had lost time, reputation, and a great deal of emotional investment. No charges were filed because no legal fraud had been committed. The land investment and railroad contracts Cross claimed were real but significantly more speculative than he represented them, dependent on a railroad line that was still years from completion if it happened at all. Fowler had mentioned it casually, as shared professional intelligence, because El Paso and Redrock were in the same territorial network, and because Fowler had heard that Cross was corresponding with a woman in Redrock. Amos sat with this for 2 days. He turned it over in his mind, examining it from every angle. He thought about Mae's history with Gerald Fitch, about the particular cruelty of being pursued under false pretenses, about what she'd told him on her porch in November of 1880 about knowing something in one place and taking longer to know it everywhere else. He thought about what it would mean to tell her, and what it would mean not to. He thought about whether he was looking for a reason to tell her because he genuinely believed she was in danger, or because he was afraid of losing her to a man in El Paso and willing to use professional information as a personal weapon. He sat with that question until it made him uncomfortable in a way he respected. He was honest with himself about his own motivations in a way that not many people were, because, in his profession, the ability to separate what you wanted from what was true was the difference between justice and something ugly that wore its clothes. What he concluded, after 2 days, was that the information about Harlan Cross was genuinely material to Mae's safety and Mae's decision, and that the right thing to do was to tell her, and that the fact that it was also the thing he personally wanted to do did not make it wrong, provided he told her completely honestly and left the decision entirely in her hands. He went to her schoolhouse on a Thursday afternoon in December, after the students had left. She was grading papers when he came in, and she looked up with a slightly wary expression that suggested she could read something in his face before he'd said a word. He told her everything. He told her about Fowler. He told her about Dorothea Sims. He told her about the railroad contracts and their speculative nature. He told her that he had examined his own motivations carefully before coming to her, and he wanted her to know that, because she deserved to know it. He didn't tell her what to do with the information. He told her it was hers and the decision was hers. When he finished, she was very still for a long moment. "The railroad contracts," she said. "He described those to me as established, generating income already. According to Fowler, they're not generating anything yet and may not for years," Amos said. She nodded slowly. Her expression was controlled, but he could see the particular quality of it, the way she was processing this through a familiar and painful framework. He had told her something that fit a pattern she already knew and had hoped very much never to encounter again. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Me, I need to say one more thing," he said. "Go ahead." "I am aware that I have a personal stake in the information I just gave you," he said. "I wanted to be transparent about that, because you told me once that you value honesty above most things, and I think you deserve to have it in every direction, including that one." The silence that followed this was very long. The December afternoon light came through the schoolhouse windows in long, pale bars. Outside somewhere, a horse moved along Caldwell Street, and the sound of its hooves on the hard ground was very clear in the quiet. "What personal stake?" she said. Her voice was careful. He looked at her steadily. "The kind that's been apparent to everyone in Redrock for the past year except apparently the two people most directly concerned." Another silence. Mae set her pen down very deliberately. "I need some time," she said. "Of course," he said. He left. He walked back to his office and sat behind his desk and was moderately terrible company for anyone who came in that day, which fortunately was not many people. Mae sat in her classroom until the sun was down. She had a great deal to think about, and she was methodical about thinking, which meant she had to think about the right things in the right order. First, Harlan Cross. She wrote him a letter that evening. She wrote it carefully, precisely, asking directly about Dorothea Sims and about the timeline and current earnings of the railroad contracts. She did not mention where she'd heard these names. She asked him to respond honestly. His response arrived in January. It was well crafted. It acknowledged Dorothea Sims with a carefully framed version of events that cast himself in a sympathetic light, as a grieving widower who had been taken in by a woman whose family had misrepresented her financial situation. It described the railroad contracts in language that was technically accurate but deeply misleading, relying on future projections that were presented as near certainties. It was, Mae recognized with a cold and familiar clarity, the work of a man who was very skilled at managing the gap between what he said and what was true. She wrote back a polite and final letter ending the correspondence. Then she picked up her journal and wrote about Amos Malone for the first time with no euphemisms and no careful distances. She wrote what she actually felt, which was considerable, and she wrote what she was afraid of, which was also considerable, and then she sat with what she'd written for 3 days before she did anything about it. What she did about it in late January was walk to the marshal's office on a Tuesday afternoon when she did not ordinarily have any reason to be there, with no pretext and no papers to deliver. She walked in and Amos looked up from his desk and went very still in the way he did when something was happening that mattered. "I ended the correspondence with Harlan Cross," she said. "I know," he said quietly. "Tommy Greer mentioned you'd sent a letter." "Of course he did," she said. She was not actually annoyed. She was almost laughing. "Amos, me. I spent 3 days deciding what to say," she said. "I had several very polished versions prepared. What happened to them?" "They were all complicated in ways that seemed unnecessary," she said. "So I'm just going to say the simple version." He watched her. "I am afraid," she said. "I am specifically afraid of the particular kind of thing you implied at the end of our conversation in December, because I have been here before in a different shape, and it went badly and I rebuilt myself from that, and I don't know what would happen if I had to do it again." He was very quiet. "But I am also," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady now, "I am also aware that I have spent the past 14 months paying more attention to a specific person than I have ever paid to anyone, including myself, and that this is a fact that has become very hard to live inside without acknowledging." He stood up from behind the desk. He moved around it slowly, the way you move when you are being careful not to frighten something that trusts you enough to be there. "I have no hidden motive," he said. "I want to say that clearly. What you have is what I want, who you are, not anything you carry or any history attached to you. I want you to know that before anything else." "I know," she said, and she did know. She had known it for months. "That is actually part of what frightened me." He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could see the winter light in his gray eyes. "I know you've been careful because you had to be," he said. "I know that being careful cost you something. I'm not asking you to stop being careful. I'm just asking if there's space inside the careful for something real." She looked at him for a long moment. The marshal's office smelled like wood smoke and paper and the cedar soap she recognized. Outside, Redrock went about its Tuesday business in perfect, ordinary unconcern. "Yes," she said, "there is space." He reached out and took her hand. His hand was warm and rough from years of outdoor work, and she felt the warmth of it spread up her arm with the force of something she'd been holding back for a very long time. They did not rush anything. This was perhaps the truest thing about them, that neither of them was capable of rushing what mattered. They were both, in their different ways, people who had learned to build slowly and carefully, who had reason to be sure before they committed, who understood that the thing you built in patience was stronger than the thing built fast. They had Friday dinners that were now something different, not in any dramatic surface way, but in the quality of the silence between the talking, which had become a comfortable and specific warmth. He called on her on Sunday afternoons. They walked along the creek when the spring came back, and he told her about growing up in the Edwards Plateau country north of San Antonio, about his father who'd been a ranger and his mother who'd been a schoolteacher, which made me say that perhaps they'd been heading toward each other from the beginning, and he laughed his rare, real laugh and agreed. He told her about the day he'd put on the Marshal's Star, 2 years before coming to Redrock, working for the county seat down in Bixar, and about the specific incident that had burned into him the importance of being the kind of lawman who thought before he acted. A young man he'd arrested on the basis of a witness statement that had later proved false. The young man had spent 4 months in custody before the error was discovered. Amos had visited him when he was released. He'd never forgotten the young man's face. He carried it with him as a reminder that authority was a thing that could crush what it was supposed to protect if you let righteousness outrun your judgment. Me listened to all of this with the total attention that was her particular gift, the quality of listening that made people feel genuinely received, and she told him things in return that she had not told anyone except her journal. About her father's death when she was 19, which had cut the ground from under her. About the 2 years of genuine happiness with Gerald Fitch before she understood what she was actually involved in. About how the particular horror of that discovery was not only the betrayal, but the loss of the good memories, the retroactive poisoning of what she'd thought was real. About how she'd rebuilt herself after, carefully and deliberately, and how the rebuilding had made her strong in ways she was glad of and careful in ways that had sometimes cost her connection. "Not this time," he said one afternoon, simply looking at her. "No," she agreed. "Not this time." He kissed her for the first time on a May evening on her porch after a Friday dinner in the warm dark with the first fireflies of summer drifting through the yard. It was not dramatic. It was quiet and serious and full of intent, like everything he did, and it felt to me like the end of a very long argument she'd been having with herself. They were both 30, give or take, both past the age of performing feelings they didn't have or pretending to certainty they'd earned, and there was a directness to their courtship that people in Red Rock observed and approved of, in the way that small communities approve of things that are solid and honest and don't require explanation. By summer they were understood in Red Rock to be a couple, a fact that gave Harriet Bowman tremendous personal satisfaction and caused Tommy Greer to lose a bet with his friend Danny Carlson about how long it was going to take. Me continued to teach. Amos continued to marshal. On evenings when neither of them had particular obligations, they shared her porch or his office step and talked until the stars were high and thick overhead, about everything and nothing, with the easy depth of people who have given each other genuine access. September brought a letter, not from Harlan Cross. From a man named Beaumont, a lawyer in El Paso representing interests connected to a land consortium whose members included, at several removes, a man whose business dealings overlapped significantly with Harlan Cross's. The letter was addressed to me. It offered her, in the dry and seemingly disinterested language of legal correspondence, a position as lead educator for a new school being established by the consortium in El Paso, with a salary 3 times what she was earning in Red Rock and housing provided, and all expenses covered in a 5-year contract. It was presented as a professional opportunity. It arrived at me's door precisely, and it was not coincidental that it arrived at all. Me read it twice and then brought it to Amos. He read it and said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "Cross." "Yes," she said, "he's found a way that doesn't look like him." "What are you going to do? Write a polite refusal," she said. "I have everything I want in Red Rock." He looked at her over the letter, and there was something in his face that she had learned to recognize over the past year, something that was the specific Amos Malone version of being moved, which was restrained and quiet and entirely real. "I was going to ask you something," he said. "Were you?" she said. "Not here, not like this," he said, glancing at the letter. "Under better circumstances." "Ask me anyway," she said. "I don't need circumstances." He put the letter down on her kitchen table. He looked at her very directly, the way he looked at everything that mattered. "Mae Whitaker," he said, "will you marry me?" She had been waiting for this question for approximately 6 months, had known it was coming, had known her answer since sometime around March, and still, the hearing of it in his voice, plain and serious and full of everything he didn't need to say because she already knew it, hit her in the chest with a force that made her catch her breath. "Yes," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it, and they stayed like that for a long time in her small kitchen, with the September afternoon going gold outside the window. And the letter from Beaumont sat on the table between them, ignored and irrelevant, waiting to be declined. They were married in November of 1881 at the Red Rock Church, which on this occasion served its original function rather than its Tuesday one. Reverend Holt performed the ceremony. Every soul in Red Rock attended who was capable of walking to the church, and several who had to be helped. Harriet Bowman cried openly and denied it. Tommy Greer and Danny Carlson were both in the second pew, Danny having had the good judgment not to bring up the bet. Mae wore a cream-colored dress with small blue flowers embroidered at the collar that her cousin Alina had sent from Houston, and Alina had come in person to deliver it, which gave me the opportunity to say, in a private moment, that despite everything, Alina's letter about Harlan Cross had led, indirectly and circuitously, to something real. Alina was delighted and took considerable credit for this, which me allowed because Alina needed things to be delightful, and this day was, genuinely, delightful. Amos in his best suit and his polished boots, and his silver star for the last time as a single man looked at her at the altar with the gray eyes that she had been cataloging for over a year, and the thing in them was so naked and honest and warm that she felt the last small guarded corner of herself open like a window she hadn't known was still shut. They said their vows. They meant them. Completely. The first year of marriage was, in the honest assessment me wrote in her journal, the most fundamentally alive she had felt since childhood. Not because it was without difficulty, because it was two strong-willed, deeply opinionated people sharing a life in a small town, which produced friction in regular and sometimes entertaining quantities. But because the friction was genuine and navigated in good faith, and always arrived, after the working through of it, at something better on the other side. They moved into a slightly larger house on the north end of Caldwell Street, a house with a proper parlor, and a study where me kept her books and her papers, and where Amos sometimes sat reading in the evening while she graded student work at the other end of the room, and the domestic ordinariness of it was something she had not expected to love as much as she did. She had thought of herself as an independent, solitary person. She discovered that what she had been was a person waiting for someone she trusted enough to be fully herself around, and that being fully herself in the company of someone who knew you completely was the opposite of solitary. They argued about the lamp in the study, which me kept too low for reading. They argued about the route of Amos's evening patrol, which she thought took him too far toward the rough end of town too late in the evening. He pointed out that the rough end of town was exactly where a marshal was supposed to be, and she pointed out that she was allowed to worry, and he said she was, and she said she knew she was just informing him of it, and he laughed and she laughed and nothing changed except that she felt better for having said it. In the spring of 1882, she found out she was pregnant. She told him on a Tuesday evening when he came home from patrol, sitting in the parlor with her hands folded in her lap, and a look on her face that he read immediately as something significant. He sat down across from her. "What is it?" she told him. The expression that crossed his face was something she stored away in her private inventory of the most important things she had ever seen. It started as surprise, moved through something she could only describe as reckoning, the deep cellular impact of a piece of information that changes the shape of the future, and arrived at a joy so unguarded that she felt her own chest fill with it. He moved from his chair to hers, or rather to the floor beside hers, and took both her hands and pressed them to his forehead for a moment, and she put her free hand on the back of his head, and they stayed like that for a while. "A boy," he said finally. "You can't know that," she said. "No," he agreed. "But either way." "Yes," she said, "either way." The pregnancy was not easy. The summer of 1882 was brutally hot, and me was tired in ways she had never been tired before, and her students were magnificent, keeping her distracted and purposeful through the worst of it, and Amos was, she had to admit, an extraordinary partner through every difficult day. He was not performatively attentive. He was quietly, practically, totally present, the kind of present that meant that when she needed something it had usually already been arranged. But the summer also brought Dred Calloway back. He came in July, not with the dry lawyer Danslow, but with 4 men, and a face full of the particular fury of someone who has found a legal angle they believe in. He'd been to Austin. He'd found a territorial clerk willing, for consideration, to flag an inquiry he'd made about the Keach property records. The corrective filing that Amos and Mae had submitted in 1881 had been processed, but Calloway had found an argument, barely tenable but technically arguable, that the corrective filing had been filed under the wrong procedural category. He arrived in Redrock announcing he was going to the county seat to file a challenge, and that any interference from Amos Malone would be documented and reported to the territorial authorities as obstruction. He was loud about it. He said it in the middle of Caldwell Street with an audience. Amos listened to all of it without moving. Then he said, "File your challenge, that's your legal right." Calloway hadn't expected that. He'd expected a confrontation. He'd prepared for a confrontation. "But I'll tell you what I'll do while you're filing," Amos said. "I'll be sending a message to the Territorial Marshal's office in Austin with everything I know about the considerations being paid to clerks in the Records Division, and I'll copy it to the circuit judge. And I'll note, for the record, that a man with your history of filing frivolous challenges to the same land parcel might want to think about whether the judge has the patience for another one." Calloway's jaw went tight. One of his men shifted his weight. The other people on Caldwell Street went very still, because this was Redrock and people here had learned the particular quality of silence that preceded things getting worse. "You're bluffing," Calloway said. "I'm informing," Amos said. "File your challenge and you'll find out which one it is." Calloway stood there for a long moment in the July heat, and then he did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He left. He got on his horse and he and his 4 men rode out of Redrock and didn't come back. Amos sent the letter to Austin anyway, documenting everything. The circuit judge received it. Within 3 months, a formal investigation into the records clerk was underway. 6 months after that, the clerk was removed from his position, and the Keach property matter was closed permanently, with a notation that any future challenges would be subject to summary dismissal. Samuel Keach came to the marshal's office and shook Amos's hand and cried a little, and Amos let him, because some things deserve to be felt out loud. By August of 1882, all of this was context and background, because in August, the situation with Harlan Cross came to its final head. Cross had not been quiet since Mae's refusal of him in January of 1881. He had been quiet in the way of someone who is regrouping. He had continued his land investment schemes in El Paso, had become entangled with a railroad consortium whose timeline kept slipping, and had, by the summer of 1882, reached a financial position that was genuinely precarious. His next target had been a woman in Santa Fe whose family had since determined his true situation and pulled back. He was running out of options. He had apparently, in his resentful accounting of things, decided that Mae Whitaker was the one who had gotten away, and that her refusal and subsequent marriage were personal affronts rather than the natural consequences of his own dishonesty. He had written, through the intermediary of the Beaumont lawyer, a letter to the Redrock School Board suggesting that Mae's qualifications were misrepresented, that she had not in fact held the full teaching certification she claimed, and that the school board should investigate before her contract renewal. Mae found out about the letter because the school board president, a fair-minded man named Aldridge who had known Mae for 2 years, came to her directly rather than acting on the anonymous tip without verification. She sat in Aldridge's office with a calm that was constructed entirely from the outside in, because on the inside she was furious, not panicked, furious. She had spent years rebuilding her professional reputation with precision and care, and had done exactly what she said she was, and the suggestion that her credentials were fraudulent was so specifically infuriating that she had to take a moment to be sure her voice was even before she spoke. She produced her teaching certificate. She produced the original documentation from the San Antonio district office. She produced letters of reference from the school board in San Antonio and from 3 professors at the institution where she had studied. She had all of these things because she was Mae Whitaker, and Mae Whitaker kept her records in order always. Aldridge looked at everything and said simply, "I thought as much." He apologized for the inconvenience. The letter from Beaumont's office was filed and disregarded. Mae went home and told Amos, who listened to the whole thing and then said, "Cross." "Yes," she said. "He's becoming a problem that needs addressing," Amos said. "He's becoming a problem that's being addressed by the truth being exactly what it is," Mae said. "I would prefer that to be sufficient." Amos looked at her. She was 7 months pregnant, and her composure in the face of a deliberate professional attack was, he thought, one of the most impressive things he'd ever witnessed. "It should be sufficient," he agreed. "But I'm going to write to the El Paso Marshal and make sure they're aware of his pattern. Dorothea Sims, the Santa Fe woman, 3 targets is a pattern. Someone should be paying attention." "Write the letter," she said. He wrote it. The El Paso Marshal wrote back in September confirming that Cross was under informal observation and that if he made another verifiable move of a similar nature, there would be grounds for formal action. In September, Mae gave birth to their son. They named him James Henry Malone, after both their fathers. He was a solid, loud, thoroughly healthy baby who arrived in the world with a set of opinions he expressed at volume, and who, from his first week, displayed a ferocious interest in the face of anyone who came near him, examining each visitor with intense gray eyes that were clearly his father's. The birth had been attended by Mrs. Delacroix, Redrock's midwife, a capable woman who'd been delivering babies in West Texas for 20 years, and whose manner was so competently calm that Mae had found it genuinely comforting rather than alarming. Amos had been in the parlor for the 3 hours it took, reportedly sitting very still and being very poor company, according to Tommy Greer's older brother, who'd stopped by to check on things and reported back to Tommy, who reported to essentially everyone. When Mrs. Delacroix brought the baby out to him, Amos held James for the first time with a careful, absolute seriousness, like he was holding something that had reorganized the entire map of what mattered, which was exactly what he was doing. "He has your eyes," Mae said from the bedroom doorway, wrapped in a quilt, leaning on the frame. "He has your chin," Amos said. "That child is going to argue with me about everything." "That child comes by it honestly from both directions," Mae said. "Come back in here." The winter of 1882 into 1883 was the quietest, fullest period Mae could remember. James was a demanding and magnificent infant who slept in unpredictable intervals and filled every corner of the house with his presence, and the 3 of them settled into the particular domestic ecosystem of new parenthood with its exhaustion and its extraordinary grace. Mae arranged a temporary leave from teaching, with the school board's full support, for the spring semester, planning to return in the fall. Mrs. Caldwell, the rancher's wife who'd spent 20 years teaching her own children, agreed to cover the classroom in the interim. In the spring of 1883, Harlan Cross made his last move. He wrote Mae a letter himself, not through Beaumont, not through anonymous tip, directly to her home address in his own hand. It was not threatening. It was, in its way, more disturbing than a threat would have been. It was an appeal. It was a man who had run out of other options trying one more angle, which was honesty. He admitted that he had misrepresented his financial situation. He admitted that the Dorothea Sims situation had been more his fault than he'd acknowledged. He acknowledged that the letter to the school board had been petty and wrong. He asked, in language that was surprisingly stripped of its usual polish, for a chance to speak with her, to clear the air, to explain that he was attempting to do better. Mae read it twice. She showed it to Amos. He read it once. His expression was careful. "What do you want to do?" "I don't want to speak with him," she said. "I don't owe him that, but I also don't want to carry this indefinitely. It's been a year and a half." "What would close it for you?" he asked. She thought about it. "I want him to understand that what he did was real," she said. "Not just the thing with me. The pattern, Dorothea Sims. The Santa Fe woman. These are real people whose lives were disrupted by a man who thought of them as assets rather than people." Amos nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You could write him back, not to agree to a meeting but to tell him exactly that. In writing, so it's clear and on record. Yes, she said. She wrote the letter. It was not long. It was precise and direct and entirely without cruelty, which made it more effective than cruelty would have been. She told Harlan Cross that she had no interest in a meeting and no desire for continued correspondence, but that she wanted him to understand something clearly. That the women he had approached, herself included, were not assets or opportunities. They were people who had trusted him with significant personal investment, emotional and otherwise, and that the harm done by his manipulation of that trust was real and lasting, and could not be cleared or explained by a subsequent display of honesty. She told him she hoped he would find a way to live that didn't require taking from people. She told him this was the last communication she intended to have with him. She gave it to Amos. He read it. "Do you want me to forward a copy to the El Paso Marshal?" "Yes," she said. He sent both. Cross wrote no more letters. The El Paso Marshal followed up 6 months later with a note indicating that Harlan Cross had sold his remaining property interests and relocated to Kansas City, apparently returning to wherever he'd originally come from. Whether he changed or simply moved his operation to a new location, neither me nor Amos would ever know, but they filed it under things they had done what they could about and moved forward. Forward was where they were pointed, and forward was where they went. Me returned to teaching in the fall of 1883. James was in the care of Mrs. Delacroix's daughter Corinne, who was 19 and capable and absolutely enchanted by James's personality during school hours. Me was back in her classroom by the second week of September with 14 new students and the particular fierce joy she felt every time she walked through that door. And the joy was, if anything, larger for the year's absence. Raydrock grew through 1883 and 1884. The new railroad spur coming through the southern pass brought a wave of new settlers, families and merchants, and a few difficult souls who required Amos's professional attention, but were, on the whole, the kind of growth that transformed a raw cattle town into something with more texture and more permanence. A new general store opened. A doctor, a real doctor who trained in Philadelphia, arrived with his family and hung a shingle, and me had a consultation with him in the spring of 1884 that resulted in the news that James was going to have a sibling. She told Amos on a Friday evening. They were in the parlor, James asleep in his room down the hall, the lamp turned low. She said it simply, directly, watching his face. He did the same thing he'd done the first time. The surprise, the reckoning, the arriving at joy. She had expected it, and it still got her completely. "When?" he asked. "October," she said. "Dr. Reeves thinks October." He reached across and took her hand, turned it in his, the way he did when he was thinking about something he wanted to be sure of. "Two," he said. "Two," she agreed. "James is going to be an absolute tyrant about this," he said. "James is going to love it," she said. "He's a generous child." "He's a bossy child," Amos said. "He can be both," she said. The second pregnancy was, by comparison to the first, considerably easier. Me was more experienced. Dr. Reeves was thorough and reassuring, and she was in better physical condition than she'd been in 1882. She taught through the first half of September and took her leave 2 weeks before the expected date, and in late October of 1884, their daughter arrived. They named her Clara Rose Malone, after me's grandmother and Amos's sister, who lived in the hill country and had not yet met any of her brother's family, but had expressed, in letters, a very strong intention to rectify this at the earliest opportunity. Clara was a small, fierce baby who arrived in the world with an expression of great seriousness, and who slept, astonishingly, through the night from the second week. James, who was 2.5, was brought in to meet her the morning after her birth, and me watched him regard his sister with intense and careful scrutiny before reaching out one tentative hand to touch her cheek. "She is very small," James said. "She will get bigger," me told him. He seemed to accept this as satisfactory and appointed himself her supervisor from that point forward. Amos's sister, Emma, came for Christmas that year. making the trip from Careville with her husband Thomas, who was a rancher and a quiet, solid man who had the good sense to recognize immediately that his sister-in-law was extraordinary and treat her accordingly. Emma Malone, now Emma Hargrove, was 34, with her brother's gray eyes and his direct manner and none of his reserve. She arrived in Redrock like a warm wind, embraced me within 30 seconds of meeting her, and spent the entire Christmas week alternating between holding Clara and asking me pointed and perceptive questions about her life with the energy of someone who'd been waiting years to approve of her brother's choices and was thoroughly pleased with what she'd found. "He was a disaster before you," Emma told me on the second evening, in the kitchen, while Amos was in the parlor with Thomas discussing cattle prices or some equivalently manly topic. "He seemed fairly well organized when I met him," Me said. "Oh, he was organized," Emma said. "He was the most organized, lonely person I'd ever seen. I used to worry about him. That whole house of his in Bexar. Everything in exactly the right place and nothing warm in any of it." She looked at me very directly. "He's warm now." Me thought about all the ways she could have responded to this. She chose the simple one. "Yes," she said. "So am I," Emma nodded once, with great satisfaction, and changed the subject. And they became, from that Christmas forward, genuine friends. The years that settled in after 1884 were the kind that don't announce themselves dramatically, but build, quietly and solidly, into the substance of a real life. Redrock continued to grow. Me's school expanded as the town's population grew, and she advocated successfully with the school board for a second teacher, a young woman named Prudence Wells from Austin who was methodical and kind, and whom he mentored with the same patient thoroughness she brought to everything. Amos served as marshal through 3 more full years, earning the respect of the territorial office and the community he'd chosen to make his. James started school in 1886, in the classroom that had been his mother's, taught by Prudence Wells since Me had withdrawn from that particular classroom to avoid the complications of teaching her own child. He was, as predicted, simultaneously brilliant and bossy, and Prudence managed him with a dry humor that Me found deeply pleasing. He was Amos's child in his directness and Me's child in the intensity of his attention to the things that interested him, and the things that interested him were, almost without exception, how things worked. Mechanical things. He had discovered at age 4 that the hinges on the front door could be removed and reinstated, and he'd been taking things apart systematically ever since. Clara, by contrast, at age 2 and then 3 and 4, was developing a personality that Me could only describe as definitive. She knew what she wanted, she communicated it clearly, and she pursued it with a persistence that made her parents look at each other across rooms on a regular basis with expressions of respectful alarm. She was not aggressive. She was simply immovable in the pleasant, cheerful way of someone who has never considered that things might not go as she intends. "She gets that from you," Amos told me. "She absolutely does," Me agreed. In 1887, Me discovered she was pregnant again. She was 33. She told Amos on a Tuesday evening in March, and this time there was no surprise in his face. Just the arriving at joy part which had become, after 2 previous children, a thing she knew intimately and loved extravagantly. "3, he said. 3, she agreed. "James is going to supervise everything," he said. "Clara is going to compete," she said. "Lord help the new one," he said, and they both laughed in the specific, warm way of people who are genuinely happy. The third child was a boy, born in October of 1887, and they named him Robert Thomas Malone, Thomas for Amos's brother-in-law who had, over 3 years, become one of the people they were closest to in the world. Robert was a round, cheerful, easy baby who seemed constitutionally inclined toward contentment, which after James's intensity and Clara's persistence was something his parents viewed with enormous gratitude. James, who was 5½, appointed himself Robert's primary protector with the solemn authority of someone who takes his responsibilities seriously. Clara, who was 3, examined Robert with the same evaluative seriousness she brought to all new developments, and then declared him acceptable and went back to her own pursuits. By 1888, Amos had been Marshal of Raydrock for 8 years. The town had grown enough that the single marshal structure was straining, and the county was putting together a plan for a proper sheriff's department to serve the expanding district. The territorial marshal's office offered Amos a position in the reorganized structure, a senior role that would take him out of the daily street patrol and into the supervisory and investigative work that used his particular skills most fully. He talked to me about it before he answered. They sat at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, with coffee and the papers the territorial office had sent, and he laid it out for her in the complete and transparent way he did everything that affected both their lives. It would mean some travel, he said. Not constant, but some weeks on the road. How many? 6 to 8 weeks a year, probably, not consecutive. She considered this. She thought about what it would mean in practical terms, what it would mean for the children, what it would mean for her own work, which had expanded since Prudence joined the school and which she was deeply engaged with. She thought about what the new role meant for him, about whether it was work he would find fulfilling, about whether the investigative and supervisory elements suited him better than the daily martial routine. "Would you be good at it?" she asked. He considered this with his usual honesty. "Yes," he said, "I think so." "Would you be satisfied by it?" "More satisfied than the current work," he said. "The work I'm most useful for isn't breaking up Friday night fights at the saloon. It's the complicated stuff. The pattern finding. The Callaway situation was more interesting to me than a month of ordinary patrol." "Then I think you should take it," she said. "We can manage the weeks away. The children are old enough." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Are you certain?" "I am almost always certain about things I've thought through properly," she said. "This I have thought through properly." He took the position. It suited him exactly as he'd predicted, and the periodic travel, while genuinely challenging for me in terms of the additional work of managing the household and the children alone, was also, she found, a time when the particular quality of their relationship was perhaps most evident to her. The letters he wrote during those weeks were some of the most straightforward, most honest things she'd ever read from anyone. He wrote as he spoke, without performance, saying exactly what he saw and thought and felt, and she kept every one of them in the box under her bed that held the important things. She wrote back in kind, long letters full of the details of the children and the school and the town, and the particular absence she felt with him gone, and the specific texture of how the house felt without him in it, which was quiet in the wrong way, and how it felt when he came back, which was right in every way. In 1889, Mae made a proposal of her own. The school was growing. Raydrock needed a larger building and a more formal program. She had been corresponding with the Territorial Education Office about funding and structure, and she had developed, over several months, a comprehensive plan for what an expanded Raydrock school could look like. She presented it to the school board in April with the same thoroughness and confidence she brought to everything, and the board approved it in full, and she spent the rest of 1889 overseeing the construction of a new school building and the recruitment of 2 additional teachers. It was, she wrote in her journal, the most professionally satisfying thing she had done since arriving in Raydrock 9 years earlier. Maybe the most professionally satisfying thing she'd done in her life. She had built something that would outlast her tenure, something real and useful and good, and it was entirely hers, and it had grown out of a life she had chosen with clear eyes. Amos came to the school dedication in October with all 3 children, and he stood in the back of the room watching her address the assembled parents and teachers and community members with the same quality of attention he'd given everything about her from the beginning, the factual, complete regard of a man who had been paying close attention for 9 years and had never once stopped finding what he observed impressive. When it was over and the crowd had cleared and the children were outside with Tommy Greer's younger sister Clara, who had grown up into a capable young woman who occasionally helped with the Malone children. Amos found me in the new classroom straightening chairs with the small domestic satisfaction of someone who loves a space she's made. "Proud of you," he said. She looked up. He said it simply, the way he said everything true, and it landed in her the way it always had, completely. "I know," she said. "I can tell, can you? I've been reading your face for 9 years," she said. "I've gotten fairly accurate." He walked across the room and put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her in the way he kissed her when they were alone, which was different from the other ways, which was the specific, concentrated warmth of a man who has nowhere else to be and nothing more important to do. 9 years, he said, his forehead against hers. "More than that," she said. 14 months before we were married, remember?" 9 years and 14 months, he said. "Almost 10, she said. He pulled back just enough to look at her. "You're not tired of me?" "Not remotely," she said. "You're still the most interesting person I've ever met. That hasn't changed." He smiled, his real smile, rare and worth every Friday dinner and late evening an argument about lamps and patrol routes and novel endings that had earned it. "Same," he said. James appeared in the classroom door at that moment, breathless, with a grass stain on his knee and an expression of great urgency. "Papa," he said, "Robert has gotten his head stuck in the schoolyard fence again." Amos closed his eyes for one moment. "Again?" "He says he's fine," James said. "Clara says he's dramatizing." "He probably is dramatizing," Mae said, already moving toward the door. "But we should help him regardless." They went out together into the October afternoon, into the particular sunlight of a West Texas fall, gold and enormous, and crossed the schoolyard to where their youngest was in fact very mildly, but genuinely stuck in the fence, while his sister offered commentary, and his older brother stood by with the resigned air of someone accustomed to managing chaos. Amos freed Robert with the practiced efficiency of a man who had dealt with this precise situation twice before. Robert was unharmed and only slightly embarrassed. Clara said she had told him not to do it. James said someone should probably talk to Robert about experimental behaviors and their consequences. Mae looked at all four of them in the October light and felt the full, specific, extraordinary weight of this life she had almost not allowed herself to have. This life that had required her to stand on a broken road between the person she'd been and the person she was still becoming, and trust the man who had looked at her with honest eyes and said, "I have no hidden motive," and meant every word of it. 10 years from now, she thought, she would look back at this afternoon as one of the ordinary perfect days, the kind you only recognize as extraordinary after they've passed. So she made an effort to recognize it now, in the moment, to be fully inside it, to feel the warmth and the noise and the specific gravity of this particular collection of people who were hers. The winter of 1889 moved into 1890 with its usual slow, cold progress, and Red Rock celebrated its 15th year as an incorporated town, with a dance in the new school building that Mae had organized, and Amos had helped decorate with strings of paper stars that James had cut out with meticulous precision. Clara danced with everyone who asked her and several who hadn't, and Robert fell asleep at 9 o'clock in a corner chair and had to be carried home by his father, which Amos did without complaint, carrying his sleeping youngest son through the cool January night with the settled satisfaction of a man who is exactly where he belongs. Mae walked beside him. Their breath made small clouds in the cold air. The stars over Red Rock were out in full, the kind of sky that reminded you how old and large the world was, and how small and vivid and irreplaceable each particular life inside it. "What are you thinking?" Amos asked. "That I almost got on a train," she said. He glanced at her. "In 1882, she said, "before you stopped me, I had convinced myself that the practical answer was the right one, that what I felt was less trustworthy than what I could quantify." "You've mentioned it before," he said. "I know," she said. "I keep coming back to it, not because I regret anything, because I'm still astonished that you were stubborn enough to stand in the road." "I had good reason," he said. "You had information about Cross," she said. But that wasn't the only reason. He was quiet for a moment. Robert shifted in his arms, murmured something that wasn't quite a word. "No," he said, "it wasn't the only reason. What would you have done if I'd walked around you anyway?" She asked. He thought about it seriously because he was Amos Malone and he thought about things seriously. "Let you go," he said. "Carried your bag to the platform like I said, because the thing I said was true, it had to be your choice. And then, spent the rest of my life being the most dedicated marshal in West Texas," he said, "and possibly a fairly bitter one." She laughed softly so as not to wake Robert. "You would not have been bitter. You're not constitutionally capable of bitterness." "Probably not," he agreed. "But I'd have been lonely for the rest of my life and known exactly why." She put her hand through his arm, the arm not holding their son, and leaned into him slightly as they walked through the dark and cold of the Redrock night toward home. "I stayed," she said. "I chose to hear what you had to say, and then I made the choice to stay all on my own because of what you said and how you said it and who you were." "I know," he said. "I want you to know that I would choose it again," she said. "Every time, 1,000 times." He stopped walking. She stopped with him. Robert breathed on, deeply asleep, his small face peaceful against his father's shoulder. Above them the stars were magnificent and indifferent and ancient. Amos looked at her in the dark. She knew his face in every light and darkness, in every weather and season, in the happiness and the difficulty and the ordinary Tuesday evenings that were the true material of a shared life. She knew it better than she knew any other thing in the world. "So would I," he said, "every single time." He kissed her there on the dark Redrock Street, under those stars, with their sleeping son between them and their other children safe in the school behind them. A decade of Fridays and arguments, and genuine honest love pressing its full weight into the present moment. She kissed him back with the whole of herself, the 26-year-old who'd arrived in this town with a carpetbag and a guarded heart, and the woman she'd become since, who had learned that the most dangerous and necessary thing a careful person could do was decide, with full knowledge and clear eyes, to be completely known. They walked home together through the cold, and the lamp in the parlor window was lit, the warm yellow light of it visible from the end of the street, and it looked, as it always did, like exactly what it was. The specific, irreplaceable thing they had built together, waiting for them to come home. In the spring of 1890, Mae planted roses along the front of the house, a thing she'd been meaning to do for years. They came up in June, red and persistent and a little wild, and Amos built a trellis for them on a Saturday morning while James supervised, and Clara suggested improvements, and Robert handed him nails with great seriousness. The roses were still blooming by September, still climbing the trellis, still entirely themselves. Mae looked at them every morning from the kitchen window while she made coffee and thought about roots, about how things that were planted in the right ground, given water and time and the basic faith that they could grow, tended to do exactly that. She thought about stubborn marshals who stand in the middle of roads and the 1 hour that had become a decade and the 1 hour that had become, in its own way, everything. She went on making coffee, the house filled with the sounds of her family waking, the particular beloved noise of it, ordinary and irreplaceable. Outside, Caldwell Street stirred into its daily business. Somewhere toward the south end of town, Amos was doing his early rounds before coming home for breakfast, walking the same street he'd walked for a decade with the same careful, responsible attention to what was there. He would come home in 20 minutes. She knew his pace and his route by heart. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table and sat down to wait for her husband in the warm morning light of a life she had chosen, and would choose again, and would go on choosing every day for the rest of her long and fully lived and genuinely happy life.